Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Fusion 360 Live. My name is Brad Tallis from Autodesk. I have Aaron on the keyboard helping out. And today's topic, we're doing kind of a fun one. Happy Halloween, everybody. I'm going to show how to create a jack-o'-lantern. Maybe, just so we're going to learn about some of the free-form tools. Maybe you want to 3D print it out later on or something like that. In fact, I 3D printed this guy. Don't tell my wife. I'm going to hide it in the house, hopefully to scare her. So anyways, what we're going to do today is use the form tools to learn about how to create a jack-o'-lantern, for example. So let's dive right in. I'm going to create a form. So I'm going to start with this create form command. And what that does is it kind of switches us into this little form workspace. So under the create, you'll see we have lots of different predefined forms. And the one I'm going to start with, because a pumpkin is pretty spherical, is I'm going to start with the sphere command. So let's go ahead and click on sphere. And I know a lot of you like my tips and tricks. Today they're going to be tips and trick or treats for you. So we're going with the Halloween theme. So I'm going to kind of do a couple different things to show how you'll get different results. So I'm starting out with my sphere, and I kind of like to make it the same size as maybe like an actual pumpkin. So let's just say maybe 12 inches in diameter, okay? So you'll notice it has all of these longitude and latitude lines on that. Well, a pumpkin is pretty spherical, but it has these like ridges and stuff in it. And so I want to be able to edit those, make those ridges kind of stand out a little bit. And if I left it just like this, I'd have to move every individual line in here, and that could take quite some time. So under symmetry, you'll see we have something in here called circular. And what that does, you can kind of see these green lines appear. Now, I'm going to make a mistake to show you what would happen if I said okay. What this basically is saying is anything that happens on one side is going to happen in all of these other quadrants. So if I were to push this line in, you'll notice, let me change it to that guy. It'll basically just kind of change the whole shape, right? It's not giving me the result that I want, okay? So what I'm going to do instead is I'll use the sphere again. We'll say 12 for the diameter. Right here, this symmetric faces, not a lot of people know about this tip. If I come in here and say 2, you'll notice that it adds those extra lines in there. In fact, if I were to say 3, for example, I now have 3 symmetric faces in each area. Well, let's just go with 2. And now what this is going to allow me to do is basically modify one of these lines, and it's going to modify it on all of these green lines, but it's going to leave the black ones alone. So for example, if I were to grab that edge and pull that out, you'll see that sure enough, it's leaving that line fairly alone. It's having to move it a little bit to keep G2 continuity. But you can kind of see how I'm only editing one and it's going all the way around. And so that's going to come into play here as we work. So that adding those longitudinal lines in the symmetry is really, really handy. Okay, the next thing is a pumpkin is not perfectly round. So I like to kind of give it some character. So the first thing I'm going to do is right click and say edit form. And I want to bring this top down a little bit. So maybe I'll just draw a box around that and bring this down, and we can kind of start to flatten out the top of our pumpkin. But I noticed that it's still kind of, let me just look at it from the front. It's kind of peaked right there at the top. Okay, so I want to bring that down. Well, you'll notice, let me do this again. Sorry, I want to make sure. Yep, okay. So I'm going to look at it from the front. And I'm just going to go ahead and edit form. And instead of moving faces, I'm going to change this to vertex. And you'll notice I get all of these vertexes. And now it's not letting me select edges or faces, it's only allowing me to select vertexes. And that's what this selection filter is right here. You can see we've got vertexes, edges. So now it's only going to allow me to select edges and nothing else. Faces, now it's only going to allow me to select faces and nothing else, or all. And that's where it allows me to do vertexes, edges, or faces. So it's kind of a selection filter. So I'm going to grab these vertexes, and you'll notice, let me kind of rotate around a little bit. Because these all come to like one point, there is a vertex right there, but you see all these little red vertexes, and I actually like to grab those. Let's just select all of those, and I'm going to pull them down, and you can kind of see we're going to start to divot into the part now. So it's basically each of these vertexes is on each of these lines. So I'll go ahead and say okay. I kind of pulled that down a little bit. Let me do the edit form again. Maybe I'll grab these vertexes. Let's just pull those down just to kind of smooth the top, make it a little bit flatter, maybe indent just a little bit. I'm not sure why I'm getting the... Let me make sure I'm in my front view. So let me actually redo. You'll notice I'm seeing a little hole right here, and I want to make sure I don't get that. So I'm going to, again, look at it from the side. Let's just see if, when I edit this, let me go ahead and select all of those. And I want to make sure I'm dragging like straight down a little bit. So I'll just do something like that. And let's see if it creates, yeah, see, basically, if I was off at an angle, it might have pulled it down at an angle. So I tend to, click on front view, top view, side view, etc. In fact, now what I'm going to do is I don't want it to be perfectly flat across the top. So maybe I'll grab some faces, like I'll grab all these faces, and I'll just rotate. Oh, no, you'll see something interesting here. Watch what's happening. I'm rotating and I'm getting a really weird result. Okay? And the reason for this is because of the symmetry. So it's trying to rotate these two faces, but that's symmetric over here. So I can't make that change quite yet. We'll get to that here in just a second. Let me change the bottom of my pumpkin. So let's do the vertexes. I'll grab all of those and kind of pull them up a little bit just to kind of give it a little bit of an indent. And then maybe grab all of those and bring them just to kind of simulate what a real pumpkin would look like. It's kind of flat on the bottom. It has a little bit of an indentation for it to kind of sit flat. And now we're starting to get kind of the shape of the pumpkin. Okay, the next thing I want to do is create those ridges. So I'm going to go ahead and select a couple of these lines. Now you'll notice I'm selecting them one at a time, okay? Because I don't want to grab all of them. Well, here's one of my tips I wanted to share with you. If you click on one edge and then hold down your shift key and double click the next edge, it actually selects that chain for you. So instead of having to do it one at a time, I had one selected and then I just shift double clicked the next line and it grabbed all of those lines in between. Okay, let me show you that. Like for example, this way I could click there, shift click over here. Now it's going to go all the way around because of the symmetry, but you can kind of see the blue line. It just went from the start to the end. So pretty cool tip. I use this all the time instead of having to click one edge at a time. Okay, now I'll come in and edit the form. Oops, sorry, I should have had edit form first. Let me select those guys. And that guy there. And then what I want to do is basically just push this edge in. And so I'm kind of looking at it from the top. And you'll notice my arrows aren't pointing in the right direction. However, I do have this plane, which will let me just kind of slide this line in. So you can kind of see I can move and rotate it a little bit if I want to. But as I push that in, you can see how we're starting to deform the pumpkin a little bit, and it's doing it all the way around. Okay, starting to look a little bit more like a pumpkin. I'll say okay, and now I have these ridges that you can kind of see very quickly created. In fact, if I were to finish my form, where you don't have all the edges, you can kind of see what that looks like. That's looking pretty cool. Now, it's still pretty symmetric, which I don't like. So we're going to come in and tweak with that. Maybe I'm going to bring the top down a little bit more, squish it around, etc. But I'm done with my symmetry. So I can come into my symmetry, pull down, and say clear symmetry. What's the surface? That's the surface. I'll say OK. And now you'll notice there's no more green lines. And if I make a change, for example, here, let me do all. If I were to, for example, pull that face out, it only happens right there. It's not happening all the way around. Okay? And you can turn the symmetry on and off as often as you want. As long as it's symmetric, it'll try and create, continue to create it symmetrically. Okay, so I mentioned I wanted to kind of angle maybe these top faces a little bit, so I'll grab those. Let me do all like so. And I'm kind of looking at it from the front. So let's just rotate that up a little bit. You can kind of see how we're going to start to deform our pumpkin. So I don't want to go too crazy, maybe just at a slight angle, but I can grab and move all of these faces around. And so now you can start kind of really tweaking with the design of what your pumpkin's going to look like. For example, maybe that I want to bump over here. So I could just grab this edge, oops, and pull that edge out a little bit. So I'm just going to grab and pull that edge out. Maybe we want to lift up a point up here, or an edge I should say. I can add that and make it a little bit rounder there, so it kind of looks like a growth or something like that. Maybe over here we'll just pull that face out a little bit. Now I want to show you a cool tip. So I selected, let's go ahead and select maybe like this point. I'm going to just pull that point out, and you'll notice how it's affecting just a little region. So I'm grabbing that point, it's barely moving that point there. You can see it just barely moves, and as the more I pull out, it becomes more of a big bump, right? Well, here's a neat tip. We have this option in here called Soft Modification, and watch what this does. So I'm going to click that point, and then I'm going to turn on Soft Modification. And it's going to be kind of hard to see, but you'll see, because if I point, it kind of highlights it, but you'll see some red lines, some dark red lines, and some dark red points, and they kind of trail out to like these white points. So we go from dark red kind of to pink to white. Now what this is saying is go ahead and move this point, but also move the other points that are kind of in that selection. So you'll notice that this point is now moving a little bit more than it was before, and it's kind of keeping this to be more of a softer extrusion than a sharper extrusion. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, you can see, for example, that we have different extents, such as distance, face count, and rectangular face count. So for example, if I click on face count, I want it to go out 3 faces, 1, 2, 3. And so now it's going to affect, and you can see it's going to pull this pumpkin out, and it's really not creating just a bulge in this one little location. It's kind of pulling the whole pumpkin out. And again, the color kind of defines the intensity of how far it's going to move. So the dark red, it's moving the most. Pink, it's moving about halfway. And white, it's hardly moving at all. Okay? So I like to do the distance. And then you can also specify the distance right here. So for example, if I said 1, you'll see I get like nothing. Okay? I'll go 2. Let's go 3. Finally, you can see 3, because I don't have very many faces or edges. It's only affecting this small area. And if I pull on that, sure enough, it's pretty much only being affected right there. However, if I were to change that from 3 to like 9, you'll see that that affects a lot more. And as I pull this out, it's actually going to pull pretty much the whole side of the pumpkin, but not the top and not the other side, etc. So it's a really cool method to, finely tune or kind of grab a whole bunch of faces and make it stay nice and smooth. Okay, then we also have different transitions. Right now it's set to smooth, and you'll notice that it's going from kind of the red slowly to the white. If I came in here and said linear, you're going to see it's going to be more of a linear transition. And if I say bulge, it's going to affect a lot more, right? It pretty much stays mostly red. In fact, you can kind of see how it's pulling that whole pumpkin all the way out. So less of a fall off on that one. Okay, so I typically use the smooth. It kind of creates a nice smooth transition. And then you also have the ability to change the weight. How you can kind of see how I can change. So it's pretty much red right there, and it pretty quickly goes to white. If I were to drag this, you're going to see the color kind of fade in. So it's a pretty powerful tool. I really like this. I use the soft modification quite often. Okay. And I'm going to use that again. You'll see that as we do the stem, I'm actually going to use that soft modification. So I'm just going to come in here and tweak with the pumpkin a little bit. Maybe pull this edge out a little bit, just to kind of make things look a little bit different. Maybe we'll tuck that edge in, something like that. Okay. And again, I could kind of tweak with this as much as I want to create a realistic looking pumpkin. And when I say finished form, it kind of gives me an idea of what that's going to look like. Okay. So let's go back into here. And another tip that I use quite often is this utilities display mode. So watch what happens when I go to display mode. It gives me a couple different options: box display, control frame, or smooth. And by default, we're in smooth. But if I were to switch to box display, we can kind of see what this thing looks like, kind of in a boxy shape. And I can see that, this kind of sticks out a lot farther than I really wanted it to. So let's go ahead and maybe push that point back in a little bit, and maybe push this point in a little bit too, to kind of smooth things out. And this is a really quick way to visually see how things are going to look, kind of in a straight edged, kind of a boxy mode kind of a thing. So we can kind of see that would bulge out. Now when I go back to display mode and say smooth, we can see, sure enough, I got rid of that sharp point that was sticking out over there, or that bulge that was sticking out over there. I can also do what's called a control frame. And so, for example, I can click, and it's kind of hard to see, but instead of grabbing an edge of the pumpkin, I'm actually clicking on the frame of the pumpkin. So I could edit the form, and I'm actually driving changes to the pumpkin using this control frame. So I can grab, for example, that guy and pull it down a little bit and make a little indentation there. So many different options. You can do box mode, control frame mode. Sorry. I hit a shortcut key that went to the splash screen. Sorry about that, guys. It's not the end of the session. Okay. So hopefully we're still sharing. Can't use my shortcut keys on the keyboard for that. Okay, so now I have the pumpkin kind of the way I want. It's not perfectly symmetrical. It's not perfectly round. I've kind of indented some stuff. I've pulled some lines and edges out, and I could keep doing this. I might even use, for example, an actual picture of a pumpkin as reference or something to help out. Thank you, Aaron, for letting me know that things are good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and finish the form. And if I expand open my bodies, we can see that sure enough, that is an actual body. So for example, if I were to section this, so I'm going to say section analysis, and let's just section it through the front, we can see that this is a solid shape, watertight shape. Now I want to simulate it to be like an actual pumpkin. So I'm going to turn off my analysis. Here's another tip. I get this question quite often. Okay, I create a section analysis, but how do I turn it off? Well, it's right here on this analysis folder. You just hit that little eyeball, and you can turn that analysis on or off at any time. Okay, so let's go ahead and shell this part out. We want to make it hollow. So I'm going to come under Modify, Shell. What's the faces or the body? So I'm just going to go ahead and click on that. And I'm going to say that most pumpkins are probably about 3/4 of an inch. So let's just say 0.75 for the wall thickness. And I'm going to shell to the inside. I'll say OK. And it doesn't look like it did anything, but if I turn my analysis back on, we can now confirm that sure enough, we've hollowed out this pumpkin. Pretty cool. Okay. So now let's work on the stem. So I'm going to go ahead and create another form. And you'll notice when I do that, it kind of ghosts out my other image. But that's okay. We can still reference it. We can still see it enough that we can use it. So a stem kind of looks cylindrical to a point. So I'm going to start with a cylinder. And you'll see why here in just a moment. Now it's asking for a plane to start on. And because my pumpkin doesn't have a single flat surface on it, I'm going to go ahead and use this top plane. And let's just look at it from the top. And I'm going to use my existing pumpkin kind of as a reference for the size of the stem. So it looks like right around here is pretty good. I'll look at it from the side or from the front. Let's just drag that stem up a little bit. Now obviously it's in the wrong spot, but we'll fix that here in a little bit. Now you'll notice it also has the green lines and it also has these symmetric faces. So by default, it'll be set to 1. But it remembered the last thing that we did. We had circular symmetry and we had 2 symmetric faces, so it remembered that for us, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that circular and I'm going to leave that symmetric. We'll say OK. And then let's position this in the right spot. So I'm going to expand open the body, say move. Let's just drag this guy up a little bit. Now, it looks a little big, so I'm going to just double click on everything and edit form and scale this down. I'm just going to scale it down a little bit, something like maybe like that, for example. Okay? Okay, so the next thing I want to do is the stem has these kind of cool little grooves in it, and that would be difficult to kind of try and model and stuff like that. But using the symmetry, I can come in here, for example, I double clicked on that one edge, so it selected the whole edge, the whole loop. I'll edit that form, and kind of looking at from the top, I'm just going to drag this in, and you're going to see it's going to start to kind of create that groovy type shape there. So you can kind of see how the farther I go, the more star-shaped we get. So I want to go maybe something like that, for example. And I'll say, OK. OK. Now, I'm pretty much done with the symmetry. So I'll come in and clear my symmetry on that guy. Say OK. And now you'll see those green lines are gone. And what I can do now is start to make this look more like a stem. Well, a pumpkin stem starts out kind of wide at the bottom and narrows down at the tip of it, basically. So I'm going to double click. In fact, let me kind of zoom up so you can see. I'm just going to click one edge. I'm going to double click it. It selects the whole chain. Then I can come in and say Edit Form. And what I want to do is I want to change the scale of it. So if I were to say Scale right now, watch what happens. It only does this top little region. Well, I want to kind of do the whole thing going from small to large. So again, this is where the soft modification really comes in. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. I'm going to do a linear, and let me undo. So let me start over. I'll click this edge. I'll do a soft modification. We'll do linear, and you can see it's red pretty much the whole way. So I'm going to make this smaller. Let's try 4. Yeah, let's go a little bit larger than that. Let's try 6, and that looks pretty good. Now watch what happens when I scale this, you're going to see that it's actually kind of tapering kind of down all the way. Okay, now that's doing the linear, so let me undo. Oops, let me, I guess I can't undo, just a second here. Edit form, I'm going to do the smooth transition. And let's do maybe like 6, for example. Oh, that's probably why. It remembered my weight. That's what was kicking me. Okay, so now you'll see, there we go. I'm getting more of a transition, a linear transition there. And that's what I want in this case. Okay, now, again, I can play around with how far I want this to change. I could also do, a linear transition, and that's going to kind of keep it more pointed like so. So that looks pretty good right there. I'll say okay. And I've now taken this complex shape and tapered it down. So I'm not having to use lofts or sweeps or anything like that. What I can do now is come in and say, for example, I want to grab all of those faces. And let's just start to rotate them to the left a little bit. You can kind of see how this is starting to shape our stem. And I can grab all of these faces and move them around. Maybe I'll grab these guys, rotate that a little bit and pull it down. And then finally maybe these guys, rotate that around, pull it a little bit like so. Okay. Then I might look at it from the top, because now it's a perfectly straight transition or whatever. Well, maybe now I'll come in here and say, well, let's rotate those to the side a little bit and pull them over. And so I can come in and basically add some organic shape to this just by twisting and rotating and all this kind of stuff. It's pretty cool. Maybe we pull this over. Again, we want it to not look like a CAD result. We want it to look like an actual organic shape. So you can kind of see how it's twisting around as we're doing this. Okay. Then I'll show you a neat little tip here. So I'm going to double click on that edge. I don't want this to be open. So I'm going to right mouse click, and it shows me the commands that make sense for what I've selected. I could insert an edge, I could bevel it, but you'll notice one of these says fill hole. So I'm going to say fill hole, and it gives me some options here. Okay, so we have reduced star. It kind of fills in those shapes, but it kind of creates some weird ridges and stuff like that. We have fill star, which basically just kind of caps everything off. And then we have collapse, which gives us, that result there, for example. In this case, I'm going to say fill star because we just kind of want it capped off. Now, if I were to check maintain creased edges, it's going to fill that face, but it's going to keep it perfectly flat. And in this case, I want it to be a little bit rounded off, like we kind of tore it off of the stock or something like that. But down here, let's do this one a little bit differently. I'll say fill hole. We'll do the fill star, but let's go ahead and maintain the creased edges. We want to kind of keep that flat. I'll say okay. And then finally, I might position this where I want it to go. So let's just say move. I'm going to rotate the whole thing just a little bit and kind of place it down into the pumpkin just slightly. Okay, so I finished my form, and now I have my design. Okay, if I were to turn on my analysis, we can see that that's sunk in just a little bit. I'll turn that back off. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create a realistic appearance for this, and then we'll get into cutting the face out. So I like to switch into my render workspace. Okay. And now we can see that we're in the render workspace, and it's using the default shiny metal material, which I find humorous. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into appearance. And what this is going to let me do is, let me turn off some of the stuff that I've been in. It's going to let me pick material, so fabric or glass or metal or whatever. Well, there's no pumpkin material in here. We're going to have to create our own. So I'm going to go into base materials. Actually, let me go into, let me go into other base materials. And this is what I was looking for. So you can see we have layered, metal, opaque, transparent. So I'm going to use, let me move this up so we can kind of see this a little bit better. Drag this down. I'm going to use this opaque material. So I'm just going to drag and drop that onto the pumpkin. And you can see it's kind of a gray right now. I'll right click on it and say edit. And one of the first things I'm going to do is let's make it look more like a pumpkin. So I'm going to drag kind of to the orange. And as you see, as I drag in here, I can kind of pick which color I want that to be. Again, depending on how far over, you can make it look like a tomato or an apple, whatever. So I'm going to go kind of for an orange kind of color, like so. We also have Pantone Colors if you wanted a specific, in fact, let's just see if they have one in here called pumpkin. There we go, like pumpkin spice, pumpkin, so there's a whole bunch in here of Pantone colors that you could use. So kind of cool. Not a lot of people know that that's in there. And again, I just found that by going into this color library right here. Okay, I like to name my material. So instead of calling it base material opaque, I'm just going to call it pumpkin. Okay. And what that allows us to do is now when we hover over it, we can see that that's pumpkin and that's steel. Now, there's no texture to it. So let's come in here and edit. And you'll also notice that we have roughness and reflectance, okay? So pumpkins don't typically reflect like shiny plastic or glass or anything like that. So I'm gonna crank my roughness up a little bit. You can kind of see how it kind of fades the light out a little bit. And I'm gonna turn the reflectance down and you can see how it's not gonna reflect that light as much. Now, it does have a little bit of reflectance on the skin, so I'm going to leave it probably just under half for both of those. Okay? So the next thing I'm going to do is hit this advanced button. And what this does is it brings up some more options, and I'll expand this out. So here you can see, again, we can change the color, the reflectance, the translucency, does it emit light, etc. But the thing we want to do right here is this relief pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and activate that. And I'll show you what I did, but I basically downloaded an image of pumpkin skin. You can see it right here. It's a JPEG. And when I say OK, it's going to grab that image and put it on as a bump texture. So, okay, obviously doesn't look all that great. And we can tell that it's not a seamless texture. However, we're going to change the scale of this. We're going to make this look more realistic. So in fact, I'm going to pan this over just a little bit. If I click this little down arrow next to image, it allows us to edit this image. And it brings up another window. Okay. And this is where kind of all the magic happens. You'll notice this is sample size is 1 inch, 1 inch. Depth is 1 inch, and then you can see that we have this tiling. Well, if I were to increase the sample size, let's go to like 6 for example, you can see that that changed. In fact, it did both 6 for the height and the width. Well, let's go maybe even a little bit larger. Let's try 12 in this case. And now it's starting to look a little bit more realistic, sort of. Okay. This height, or I'm sorry, this depth allows you to define how deep does this texture go. Okay. So for example, if I were to change this to 0.1, we'll see that it barely has the texture to it now. It's not as embossed or engraved or whatever. So maybe that's not quite enough. Let's go from 0.1, let's try 0.5 and see what that looks like. So maybe somewhere in between there. So let's do 0.25 and see what that looks like. And that gives us a little bit of better texture, but to me it looks like it's going the wrong way. So I'm going to leave this alone for now. We might come back to this in a moment. and I'll say apply, and I'll say close. So why is this going the wrong way? Well, that has to do with this texture map controls. What this allows you to do is kind of specify which direction does grain go. For example, wood grain, or marble, or pumpkin, whatever. So I'm going to click on texture map controls, and I'll select on our pumpkin, and it says right now it's using automatic. So it doesn't really know which one should it use. Does it use cylindrical, planar, spherical, etc. So you can see it's set to automatic. Well, this is a pretty spherical shape, sort of a cylindrical shape, so I might try both of these. So I'm going to go ahead and say spherical, and you'll notice that it's asking for an axis, and I can click on this vertical axis here, and now we can see that the grain is kind of going the right direction. You can kind of think of it almost like wrapping paper, wrapping that image around a sphere. Okay? If I had said planar, for example, you'll see how awful that looks, because it's trying to wrap it on a flat plane, and then it's basically stretching it around. So obviously planar is not good. Box could potentially work, but it's basically putting the image on a box shape. We tried spherical, and then we also have cylindrical, which I think would work in this case, but I'm going to switch it back to spherical. But we see this weird line right across here, and again, that's probably where the image is tiled. But I can grab this arrow and drag it up, and sure enough, as I do that, you can kind of see how it's taking this wrapping paper and wrapping it around a spherical shape. And this is a very visual representation of what we're doing there. So I'm just going to drag that arrow up until we get something that looks like that. Okay, much more realistic looking, I think. Starting to look like a pumpkin. I'll do the same thing for the stem. Let's just go in here. In fact, I kind of like what this image looks like. It'll probably look good on the stem. So I'm going to right click on this guy and say duplicate, or duplicate. And it looks like it did the exact same thing. So there's pumpkin and there's pumpkin 1. So let's edit that. Let's change the name to stem. And I want kind of a dark green for the stem. Now I haven't applied it to this stem yet, so you can't really see anything. So let's go ahead and drag it onto there. And we can see what that looks like. And sure enough, you can kind of see the texture. Almost looks like a pickle. A little bit too bright green for my taste, so I'm going to go back and edit that. Maybe drag it down a little bit more to be a little bit darker. I can change the scale of the texture, so you can kind of see. I can make it really rough, kind of large there, or I can drag this down and we can kind of see, make it a little bit more defined to this particular size of this part. I could also, for example, change its roughness, make it shiny or whatever. So I might change that to reflect a little bit more light, or a little bit less light, I mean, since it's more of an organic shape. Okay. So I'm pretty much done with the look of it. So let's jump back into the design. And you can kind of see it shows the texture on my pumpkin, which I think is kind of handy. I like it so far, so I'm going to go ahead and save this into my pumpkin, into my Tech Thursdays. We'll save that there. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to basically carve the pumpkin. So to do that, I need to bring in an image that will help me out, and I need to have a plane to put that image on. So I'm going to create an offset plane, and I'm just going to go ahead and offset this front plane, and I'm going to look at it kind of from the top because I don't need it to go too far away. I just want it to go in front of the pumpkin a little bit, like so. I'll say okay, and I now have this plane that's kind of floating out in front of our pumpkin. What I can do now is insert a canvas, and you can kind of see by the image or the thumbnail that pops up, this allows you to bring in a digital picture, a napkin sketch, or whatever, and apply it to that plane. So I'm going to say canvas onto that plane. And what I did is I just went out to Google and I just did a search for jack-o'-lantern faces, and you can see all the different ones that come up. And I just grabbed one of these and saved it. So for example, I'll click on that guy there, save image as, right? And I could save that image into my downloads and call it good. Okay. And I did the same thing for that pumpkin texture. I just did a search for pumpkin texture, and you can kind of see all of the different textures. In fact, I think this is the one that I used. So there's a lot out there, and there's even I think Aaron was linking to some web pages out there that have seamless textures where you can make your own, etc. So okay, so now I have the face. I'll grab the image. So there's the one I just downloaded. I'll use this one. This is the one I kind of showed in the well, actually, you know what, I'll do that one. That one looks fun. I'll say open, and you can see that it's going to put it on that plane. Okay, now I have some control over this. I can flip it horizontal if I want to. I can flip it vertical if I need to. And then I can change the scale. So what I typically do is I look straight at the front and I scale this up and kind of position it where I want it to be. So I'm just going to kind of drag that and put it like so. It's kind of where I want it. I can change the opacity of this if I need to. So I'll just, drag this down, something like this. Say okay. And all we've done is basically put a canvas that we're going to use. So now I can create a sketch. Zoom up on this a little bit. I'll do the easy stuff now. Again, I'm not going to worry about is this exact. I'm just kind of using this image as a reference. So I'm just getting fairly close. I'm not going to be concerned, is this a fully constrained sketch? We're not going to dimension anything. It's literally just for creating, an image like so. Like so. Okay, and then how am I going to do this curve here? So I'm probably going to use the spline command. So I go ahead and click. I'm just going to click a couple points that kind of define the shape of the mouth. And I'm going to do this as two separate splines, because if I started to curve around, you'll see that it's going to want to round that corner off. And I kind of want to keep it sharp, like we've used a knife to cut this particular shape. So I'm just going to, again, click a couple points, like so. With splines, typically less is better. If you go too many points, it's harder to control. I could come in and move these around if I wanted to, but like I said, it's just to get close. And then for these shapes, I'm actually going to cheat. I'm going to use the rectangle, but I'm going to use the 3-point rectangle. So maybe I'll click one point here. I'll click another point there, and then I'm just going to drag up. And again, I don't really care if it's exactly correct. I'm just kind of getting the position of the teeth because I kind of like what that looked like. So I'm just going to grab one point, grab a second point, and drag down. Now, if I wanted to, I could come in here and, change the size of these. I could get rid of that these have to be parallel and all kind of stuff. But again, I'm going to just say finish sketch. I now have a sketch that I can use. So I'm going to grab these profiles. I didn't worry about trimming any lines or anything like that. We'll say extrude. Start to drag in, and you can see that we're now cutting into our pumpkin using the cut command. This is so much faster than actually having to physically carve a pumpkin, and it's less messy. Okay, so there's our pumpkin face, like so. Okay. Now, for fun, I want to create a realistic rendering, and I want to pretend that there's a light in there. Now, to save time, I'm not going to cut the top off. You could create another sketch and do your zigzag pattern and split the body. Maybe I'll do that if we have time at the end. But what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to create a small candle. And to do that, I'm just going to use a cylinder, almost like one of those little tea tea candles. Let me turn off the body real quick, like so. And I'll do this top face. And a tea candle is about 1.5 inches or whatever in diameter, 1.75 inches, let's just say. And I'm just going to leave it like that. Okay? So all I did was create this cylinder. And I'm going to move it into the correct location. Now, again, I like to let Fusion do the hard work for me. I don't know how far I need to move it. Let's turn on our analysis, and I can start to drag this down. And I can very visually see when I'm down near the bottom. In fact, I could even indent this if I wanted to. But try imagining doing that like this. You really don't know how far down you need to go. I could rotate and stuff like that, but that doesn't help me. I love the fact that I can turn on my analysis and drag it down to the correct height. So let's just do something like that. Say okay, turn off our analysis, and now that candle's right in the center, right where it needs to be. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to the render workspace. And now you can see our pumpkins looking pretty cool. It's kind of perspective mode. We see the candle in there. We see the texture. We got the green stem, etc. And what's really cool is I can go back and edit this green stem. I can make it wider at the bottom and stuff like that. That's what's so cool about the freeform design. But what I want to do now is create a realistic rendering. I want this candle to glow. So for example, if I were to just hit render right now, here's a trick. Hopefully you know this trick. You notice how fast it's rendering? That's because of this little render options. And I've limited my resolution. I've cranked it way down. If it was set to 100, it's going to sit here and render, and it takes a long time. But I always crank this down when I start messing with my lighting, my shadows, backgrounds, etc. And I can kind of see, I can sort of see the texture, but we can see that it's really dark inside the pumpkin. Okay? So I'm going to add another material. And under under miscellaneous, I apologize, we have this emissive. And it's broken down, it's also in other, but the other is more like the LCD screens. This emissive is your light bulbs. So you can kind of see we've got frosted bulbs, we got LED bulbs, colored, etc. So I'm just going to grab this LED right here. I'm just going to drag and drop it onto that candle. Now what this is going to do is it's going to emit light in all directions. Okay. If I wanted to, let me undo that. I could come in here and say faces and drag it to that one face, and now it's only going to emit light straight up. But I kind of want it to bounce all the way around and all that kind of stuff, so I'm going to just assign it to the whole thing. So I'm going to say bodies. I'll drag that to that body and say close. So here is why I highly recommend cranking this to the lowest 20%. Because when I hit render now, we can kind of see what this is going to look like. And sure enough, it's got some light going on. We can kind of see some reflection, etc. And maybe I want to edit that material. So this LED, I could come in and edit this guy, and we can see the luminance. And watch what happens when I crank this up. It's going to re-render, but you're going to see that it's actually going to increase the amount of light inside of the pumpkin. If I were to crank this way down, you're going to have hardly any light, and if I just barely start to bring that up, you can kind of see how that works. So I'm going to crank that pretty far up because I want it to illuminate as much as possible. And then the other thing I like to do is put it into a realistic representation, a realistic background. So, for example, I might come in here and crank the ambient light down. Well, as I'm doing this, you'll notice that the background is still staying gray, but the pumpkin's getting darker. And I like to put a realistic background in. So let's do that real quick. And that's as simple as, in fact, you can kind of see when I stop the rendering, you can kind of see what this ambient light really does. It's how much light is in the room, basically. So we're going to come back to that here in just a moment. I'm going to switch back to my design workspace. And I'm just going to create a big, huge box. So I'll say box on that face there. And I'm going to zoom kind of way out. And, oops, sorry, create a box. I always think it's centered, but it's point to point. So I'm just going to do a large box, something kind of like this. Now it's slicing through the middle of it, so it thinks it wants to cut. I want this to be a new body. There it is. And I'm just going to move it back behind the pumpkin. So this is basically just a backdrop. So I'm just going to do something kind of like that. Okay. Big, huge wall. We'll switch back into my render workspace. And let's just zoom up on this guy. Now I can come in and add a decal to this big backdrop. And I've already done this. I'll show you the image. I went out and I did a search for like Halloween backgrounds, and so you can kind of see this one's pretty cool. It's got like this moon with clouds and some branches. So I'm going to go ahead and say open and apply that as a decal, and you can see how it came in. So let's rotate that the right direction. I can flip it horizontal or vertical. You can see all the options you have there. And then what I'm going to do is kind of position it where I want this to be, scale it up a little bit maybe, something like that. And then kind of get my scene set up. So I might zoom up on my pumpkin a little bit more. And let's just scale this down. And so I'm just kind of making it simulate like it's sitting on this little bench or whatever. Or sorry, on the deck. Okay, so let's just do something like that. So it kind of fills up my whole screen a little bit. And I'm just using this as a decal. So now if I render, so I'm going to come in here to my in-canvas render, we'll see a couple things happen. So I see a bunch of gray going on over here, so I need to make my image just a little bit bigger. But you can kind of see how, to me, it looks a little bit more realistic. So I need to fix that real quick. I'm just going to rotate slightly and zoom in just a little bit. I might also come in and change the appearance of this to not be as shiny or whatever. And then finally I'll come in and set my resolution. Let's go ahead and render, and let's just check out the ambient lighting. So I can kind of see how well lit my pumpkin is. And if I came in here, I could either decrease to make it a little bit darker, moody type background or whatever. You can kind of see what that looks like. Or if I were to increase it, you're going to see that it's going to make it much brighter, which I don't think looks as good. So I kind of come in here and just kind of mess with what I think is, you know, a good middle of the road kind of a thing. And let's just call it right there. And then finally, when I'm happy with what it looks like, I could crank this all the way up, and it's going to do a full-blown, really nice render. Okay. So I'll let that render. Now I'm doing an in-canvas render. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. I would probably tend to do a local render or a cloud render. So if I do a local render, I can go ahead and say render, and it's going to create a nice rendering of that. It's not going to tie up my machine. I can go back and edit my design or whatever and create other renders. So you can kind of see how it's thinking about that and rendering that for me. Okay, let me go back to my design. And like I mentioned before, I can turn a lot of these off. Oops. Now, because I have that big background, you can kind of see how it highlights it. But I could come in and edit the form for that stem at any time. I could come in and change the scale of this. So, for example, I'll just drag that to be bigger, and we can make it flare out more at the bottom. So maybe after I've done my render or something like that, I want it to see what it looks like so. Okay. Again, this was kind of a fun one. I don't know how many of you are going to be making pumpkins and stuff like that, but I kind of wanted to show how you can use freeform to create some pretty organic shapes very, very quickly. I mean, I could go in here and say print, 3D print, and print this out on my 3D printer and have, a pumpkin as a display or something like that. So instead of using complex surfaces or lofts and sweeps, the form tools are actually really, really handy. So hope to see you on a future live stream. Thank you for attending and hope you have a wonderful Halloween. Give a shout out to Aaron. Thanks for helping out, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.